Hi, I am Hercule Poirot, and welcome to my new mystery case.
The first flakes of Christmas snow drifted over the countryside as dusk crept across the rolling hills of Surrey. Winterberry Hall, an imposing Georgian estate of pale stone and ivy-veined walls, glowed warmly from its many windows as if inviting the world to step inside and forget the cold. But despite the festive wreaths and the crystal lanterns illuminating the grand entrance, there was an unmistakable tension in the air that even a stranger would have sensed. Captain Arthur Pembroke, master of the house, stood before the crackling fire in the great hall, tugging absently at the edge of his scarlet dinner jacket. Tall, broad-shouldered, with streaks of silver at his temples, he carried himself with the lingering posture of military service. Yet tonight his usually stern countenance seemed troubled, his eyes sharp, restless, scanning the staircase whenever a shadow moved upon it. "Arthur," called Lady Evelyn Pembroke, descending the stairs with the practiced grace of one accustomed to admiration. "Our guests will be arriving within the hour. Do try to look less like a man about to face a firing squad." Captain Pembroke offered a strained smile. "I merely wish this evening to pass without complications." "Complications?" Lady Evelyn arched a delicate brow. "At our Christmas Eve gathering? My dear, what a notion!" He said nothing more, and she, sensing his reluctance, let the matter drop. After all, her husband had been secretive for weeks, ever since that troubling letter had arrived from Paris. She had not been permitted to read it, and that naturally was the sort of thing a wife could not easily forget. By 7 o'clock, the first of the holiday guests swept into Winterberry Hall on a flurry of introductions and the rustling of expensive overcoats. Among them were Dr. Lionel Grace, a long-time family friend, genial yet watchful, his round spectacles glinting whenever he narrowed his eyes in thought. Miss Clarissa Vale, the Pembrokes' young cousin, beautiful in a fragile way, with a tendency to hover nervously at the edge of conversations. Mr. Julian Harwood, a suave art dealer whose charm struck some as effortless, and others as rehearsed. Mrs. Agatha Whitcomb, a widowed philanthropist known for her sharp wit and sharper observations. The Reverend Giles Morton, pious and soft-spoken, but with a penetrating gaze that hinted at a lifetime of unspoken judgments. Winterberry Hall had hosted holiday gatherings for more than a century, but rarely with such an oddly matched assortment of personalities. Still, the guest list was not what drew the hushed whisperings among the servants. It was the rumor, passed from footman to maid, maid to cook, that Captain Pembroke had arranged tonight's festivities with a most unusual urgency. As the drawing-room filled with the warm glow of chandeliers, conversation flowed, albeit with the somewhat forced cheer of guests who sensed that their host was unsettled. Captain Pembroke circulated among them, offering wine and polite inquiries, yet his gaze repeatedly drifted to the French doors leading to the terrace, as though expecting an arrival no one else had been told about. It was only when the clock chimed 8 that the evening took a decidedly curious turn. The butler opened the main door, admitting a gust of cold air and, with it, a man of unmistakably foreign elegance. A small figure, immaculately dressed, coat collar neatly aligned, mustaches precise and waxed to symmetrical perfection. "Hercule Poirot," announced the butler with a tone of mild astonishment, for his master had said nothing of inviting Europe's most celebrated detective. A ripple spread through the room. Lady Evelyn stared, wide-eyed. Miss Clarissa clutched her necklace. Mr. Harwood's expression briefly tightened before he smoothed it away. Captain Pembroke stepped forward quickly, the color draining from his face. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, You came." Poirot inclined his head. "You requested my presence with great urgency, Captain Pembroke. The letter you sent spoke of a matter of grave importance. So naturally, Hercule Poirot did not delay." Lady Evelyn turned sharply to her husband. "A letter? Arthur, what on earth is this about?" He hesitated, swallowed, and forced a smile that fooled no one. "There is nothing to concern yourself with." merely a private matter. Poirot, shedding his overcoat with practiced delicacy, observed the room. "Ah, but when a man uses such words, madame, one can be certain that the matter is, in fact, most concerning." Several guests exchanged glances. Captain Pembroke cleared his throat. "Perhaps we might discuss this later, Poirot. After dinner." Poirot did not sit. "I fear, my friend, that later may be too late. You wrote that you had received a threat." A gasp escaped Miss Clarissa's lips. "A threat? To whom?" Before Captain Pembroke could answer, a sudden tremor seemed to pass through him. His right hand twitched. For a moment he stared not at his guests, but at the window behind them, where snow fell in thickening silence. Then, with a strangled exhale, he collapsed. Lady Evelyn screamed. Dr. Grace rushed forward. Furniture scraped as guests stumbled aside. "Stand back," the physician commanded, kneeling to examine the stricken host. Poirot moved quickly, though with less haste than precision, to observe without interfering. His eyes tracked every detail, the positioning of the captain's limbs, the faint scent in the air, the thin sheen of perspiration upon the man's brow. After a tense moment, Dr. Grace looked up gravely. "He is alive," he announced, "but barely. We must get him to a quiet room immediately." Two footmen lifted Captain Pembroke with care, carrying him down the corridor as his wife followed in near hysterics. The guests remained frozen, their festive holiday spirits extinguished. Only Poirot stood calm, hands clasped before him, moustaches quivering ever so slightly. "Monsieur Harwood," he said softly, "you look distressed." The art dealer blinked. "Anyone would be. The man nearly died in front of us." Poirot's gaze lingered. "Yes, nearly." He turned toward the corridor where the captain had been taken. "There is more here than illness or shock," Poirot murmured. "Tonight I sensed fear in this house, even before I crossed the threshold." His eyes narrowed. "And now I fear, mes amis, that Captain Pembroke's threat, whatever its nature, has arrived sooner than even he expected." Poirot straightened, his expression calm but resolute. "This is no accident. The crime has already begun." The corridor outside Captain Pembroke's private chamber was dimly lit, the sconces casting muted halos along the panelled walls. A hush had fallen over Winterberry Hall, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Poirot waited silently near the doorway, observing the comings and goings of Dr. Grace and the anxious servants. He neither fidgeted nor paced. Instead, he stood with perfect stillness, his eyes sharp beneath lowered lids, absorbing each subtle detail like a scholar studying a manuscript. When Dr. Grace finally emerged, wiping his spectacles with a trembling hand, the guests who had gathered in uneasy clusters turned toward him with apprehension. The physician cleared his throat, but he did not speak immediately, an omission which in itself told Poirot something. Words delayed were often words feared. "He lives," Dr. Grace said at last. A collective exhale swept through the hall, but the doctor lifted a hand for silence. "He is in a precarious condition, severe shock, rapid heartbeat, and what appears to be a sudden collapse of strength. I cannot yet determine whether it was brought on by stress, illness, or something else." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "You choose your words with care, Doctor. That is good. Precision is the friend of truth." Lady Evelyn, her eyes red from crying, clutched the back of a chair for support. "Arthur has never been a fragile man. What could have caused this? He was perfectly well this morning." "Was he, madame?" Poirot asked gently. "Or did he merely appear so for your benefit?" She faltered, opening her mouth to answer, but Dr. Grace interjected. The captain insisted on maintaining a semblance of normalcy. He confided in me that he had been feeling uneasy, not physically ill, but troubled. Poirot's gaze shifted with interest. Uneasy in the mind is sometimes just as dangerous as unease in the body. At this remark, Mrs. Whitcomb folded her arms. Really, Monsieur Poirot, the man collapses, and now you speak of psychology. We need facts, not abstractions. Madame, Poirot replied, psychology is a fact, and tonight it is perhaps the most important one. A faint sound echoed from down the hall, a soft footstep, hurried yet deliberate. Poirot turned just in time to see Miss Clarissa Vale slip away around a corner. Her departure was too swift to be casual, too self-conscious to be innocent. He made note of it without calling attention to her. The moment for confrontation had not yet come. He addressed Lady Evelyn instead. You mentioned earlier, Madame, that the captain received a letter from Paris which troubled him deeply. May I ask if you saw any part of it? No, she said. He hid it from me. Arthur is a proud man, Monsieur Poirot. If something threatened him, he would never show fear, not even to his wife. And yet, Poirot murmured, fear is what I sensed the moment I entered this house. It was not merely in your husband, Madame, but in the very air. Mr. Harwood exhaled sharply. If you're suggesting someone here is responsible for what happened, I should hope you have reason beyond atmospheric impressions. Poirot's mustaches twitched. Atmosphere often contains more truth than men admit. Before Harwood could retort, a loud clatter issued from the drawing-room. All eyes turned toward it, and Poirot gestured for the group to follow. Inside, the French doors leading to the terrace rattled violently as a gust of wind forced them partly ajar. Snow blew inward in a thin white veil. Dr. Grace frowned. I thought those doors were firmly shut. They were, Lady Evelyn whispered. Arthur locked them earlier. He said he wished to avoid draughts. Poirot approached the doors, examining the latch. His fingertips traced the metal surface with delicate precision. This was forced. Quite recently. Mrs. Whitcomb recoiled. Forced? In this weather? Who would venture outside at such a moment? Poirot murmured. A person who wished not to be seen entering or exiting by the main passageways. Perhaps one who feared a witness. He stepped out onto the terrace. The wind cut sharply at his coat, and snow clung to the balustrade in uneven drifts. But Poirot was not interested in the snow itself. He was interested in the impressions within it. There were footprints, several, a confused tangle, as though someone had moved back and forth nervously. But what drew him most was the pattern, a deliberate effort to obscure direction. A clumsy person would have left an obvious trail. A cunning person would have attempted to leave none. But someone trained in deception, someone fearful, their attempts often betrayed urgency rather than logic. These prints were neither artful nor accidental. They were anxious. He stepped back inside. Our visitor from outside did not come from great distance. The tracks end abruptly, suggesting they began here. Meaning what? Reverend Morton asked. Meaning, Poirot said softly, that someone inside this house stepped outside only long enough to leave misleading evidence. A gesture made in haste, a gesture of a mind under strain. Uneasy silence settled over the room. Poirot motioned the guests inward, closing the doors once more. Mes amis, Captain Pembroke invited me here because he feared a threat. He collapsed before he could explain its nature. Therefore, until we understand what occurred, no one is to leave Winterbury Hall. Lady Evelyn gasped. You cannot imprison us in our own home. It is not imprisonment, Madame, Poirot said with impeccable calm. It is protection. Mr. Harwood stepped forward. Against whom? Poirot looked at each face in turn. His gaze was neither accusing nor gentle. It was simply observant, precise, unblinking. Against the person who sought to harm Captain Pembroke, he said. And who may not be finished. A tremor of fear passed through the group. Miss Vale, having quietly reappeared, clasped her hands together. Monsieur Poirot, do you truly believe someone here wished Arthur dead? I believe, Poirot replied, that someone here fears the truth. And fear, Mademoiselle Clarissa, is the most fertile ground from which crime can grow. The clock chimed softly in the corner, a reminder that night was deepening, that isolation was complete. Poirot folded his hands behind his back. Now, mes amis, we begin. One by one I shall speak with each of you. For even in a house filled with secrets, the truth has a way of revealing itself to the one who listens closely. And with that, the psychological game commenced. Dr. Grace had barely closed the door to Captain Pembroke's chamber when Poirot signaled discreetly for the others to follow him back toward the drawing-room. The guests moved reluctantly, as if each step brought them deeper into a labyrinth from which they could not easily escape. The storm outside intensified, the wind tapping insistently at the windows like an impatient messenger. Poirot paused near the hearth, his silhouette etched sharply against the rising flames. "I will begin with simple questions," he announced, "for simplicity, mes amis, is often the lantern that illuminates the darkest corners." His gaze drifted first to Mrs. Whitcomb, who stiffened with indignation before he had even spoken her name. But he did not address her. Instead, he turned to Reverend Morton. "You, Monsieur le Révérend, were standing nearest to Captain Pembroke when he collapsed. Did you observe anything unusual before that moment?" The Reverend clasped his hands behind his back. Only that he seemed distracted. His eyes kept darting toward the windows as though expecting someone or something to appear. "Ah," Poirot murmured. "Expectation is a powerful state of mind. It reveals much about fear." Mrs. Whitcomb interjected sharply. "Really, Poirot, anyone would be uneasy with this dreadful weather and that sudden arrival of yours. The man was surely overwhelmed." Poirot tilted his head slightly. "You find my arrival overwhelming, madame?" She faltered. "I meant no insult, only that the timing was dramatic." "Dramatic," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, perhaps to some. But to Captain Pembroke, my arrival was a relief." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Lady Evelyn looked unsettled. "Arthur did not tell me he had written to you. I only learned it when you arrived tonight." "Indeed," Poirot said. "Secrecy where danger is involved is a curious choice, is it not?" Mr. Harwood stepped closer to the fire, his posture tense. "Are you implying he didn't trust his own wife?" "No," Poirot replied softly. "I am implying he trusted no one." Silence followed, broken only by the steady ticking of the mantel clock. Poirot allowed the tension to settle before shifting his focus. His eyes landed on Miss Clarissa Vale, who attempted to avoid his gaze by studying her hands. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "you left the corridor earlier in some haste. Is there something you wish to avoid?" Her head snapped up, alarmed. "No. Monsieur Poirot, I only needed a moment. The sight of the captain collapsing was dreadful. I felt faint." Poirot regarded her closely. "A natural reaction. And yet your footsteps were quick, purposeful, not the unsteady steps of faintness." Miss Vale swallowed hard. "You misunderstand me." "Perhaps." Poirot smiled faintly. "Perhaps not." Dr. Grace cleared his throat. "If we are to speak of reactions, Poirot, might I remind you that Captain Pembroke is still in danger? Should we not focus on determining whether he was poisoned?" Poirot nodded gravely. "We shall. Tell me, Doctor, did you detect any sign, any scent or residue that suggested poison?" "No," Dr. Grace said, though uncertainty flickered in his voice. "But some agents leave little trace." "That is true," Poirot conceded. "And yet, there is another possibility. A collapse brought on by intense psychological strain." He tapped a finger thoughtfully against his chin. "The mind can fell a man faster than any toxin if properly provoked." Mr. Harwood let out a derisive laugh. "So now you suggest someone scared him into unconsciousness?" "Fear," Poirot replied, "is a weapon more common than gun or blade, and we know he was expecting danger. Danger that arrived tonight." Poirot began to pace slowly, stopping near the French doors. Let us consider our intruder, or our pretended intruder. The footprints outside were the work of someone inexperienced at deception, a mind in turmoil. Miss Vale flinched. Reverend Morton crossed himself. Mrs. Whitcomb scoffed. Or a servant. No, Poirot said. A servant would not risk exposure. These prints were made by someone fearful of being suspected, not by someone hoping to avoid suspicion entirely. He turned on his heel. Now, we must examine motive. Captain Pembroke, shortly before his collapse, was poised to explain something urgent. Lady Evelyn pressed a hand to her throat. He said nothing to me about danger. Nothing. Madame, sometimes danger is born not from enemies abroad, but from secrets kept close to home. She paled visibly, but said nothing. Poirot's voice softened. You love him deeply, that is evident, but love does not always grant sight. Sometimes it blinds. Lady Evelyn's eyes glistened, but she nodded faintly. Poirot surveyed the room once more. In such a house as this, filled with history, with pride, with private burdens, it is inevitable that each of you carries something hidden. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, each wondering how much Poirot already knew, how much he suspected, how easily he might expose what had been long concealed. Poirot clasped his hands behind him. We begin the interviews now. One by one I shall hear your accounts of this evening, of your relationships with Captain Pembroke, and of anything that may have transpired before my arrival. Mrs. Whitcomb bristled. You cannot interrogate us like criminals. No, madame, Poirot replied. I question you as witnesses. It is entirely up to each of you whether your answers suggest more. Reverend Morton murmured a prayer under his breath. Poirot continued, We start with you, Mr. Harwood. Your expression during the captain's collapse spoke of more than shock. Harwood stiffened. You are mistaken. Perhaps, Poirot said softly. But let us see. He gestured toward a smaller, adjoining room. If you will join me there, monsieur, we shall begin. As Harwood hesitated, Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet certainty. The unraveling of Winterbury Hall's secrets had finally begun. Mr. Harwood stepped into the smaller room with visible reluctance, his usually polished composure marked now by a stiffness around the shoulders. Poirot closed the door behind them with a soft click, shutting out the murmurs of the others. A single lamp lit the room, casting long, angular shadows across the rug. Harwood remained standing, as though sitting might suggest a weakness he did not wish to reveal. Poirot, however, settled comfortably into a high-backed chair, crossing one leg neatly over the other. Please, monsieur, Poirot said with a polite gesture, do not exhaust yourself by pretending you are at ease. Sit. We speak only to clarify what has happened tonight. Harwood hesitated, then seated himself, though his posture remained rigid. I have nothing to hide, if that is what you intend to imply. Ah, Poirot murmured. It is always interesting when a man speaks of hiding before any suggestion has been made. Continue, monsieur. Harwood exhaled sharply through his nose. You are twisting my words. No, Poirot replied. I am listening to them. There is a difference. For several moments there was only the quiet hum of the lamp between them. Poirot observed Harwood closely, the tightened jaw, the faint tremor in his fingertips, the way his eyes darted toward the window as though contemplating escape. You knew Captain Pembroke well? Poirot asked. We were professional acquaintances, Harwood said. He occasionally purchased pieces for his collection through my gallery, nothing more. And yet you wear the expression of a man confronted by more than the illness of a casual acquaintance. Harwood leaned back, attempting a confident smile. You misread me. Poirot's mustaches lifted slightly. I rarely do, monsieur. Let us examine your earlier reaction. When the captain collapsed, you did not rush forward, nor did you look shocked. Instead, you looked Resigned. Resigned, Harwood repeated. You think I expected it? Poirot steepled his fingers. Not expected, perhaps. Feared, possibly. Harwood shook his head. I feared nothing of the sort. The man simply collapsed. You're reading meaning where none exists. Meaning always exists, Poirot said softly. It merely waits for someone to decipher it. Harwood rubbed his temples. Look, I admit I wasn't as startled as the others, but collapses are not uncommon. My mother suffered from heart trouble. I've seen similar episodes. A plausible explanation. Poirot's tone did not change, but his eyes sharpened. Then tell me, why were you watching Captain Pembroke so closely even before he collapsed? Harwood froze. He blinked once, slowly, as though attempting to recalibrate his thoughts. I wasn't watching him. I was watching the door behind him. I thought I heard something outside. Outside? Poirot repeated. Before the storm reached its strength. Harwood hesitated again, then nodded. Yes. Poirot allowed silence to stretch between them once more. You must forgive me, monsieur, but Miss Vale also left abruptly earlier, and she too claimed to be disturbed by something. It becomes interesting when multiple people report vague disturbances at similar moments. You think Clarissa and I are conspiring? Harwood scoffed. The girl is barely capable of holding a conversation without trembling. Poirot leaned forward slightly. It is unwise to underestimate the frightened, monsieur. Fear can make one clumsy, yes, but it can also make one cunning. Harwood's expression hardened. I have nothing to do with whatever happened to Pembroke, and I certainly have nothing to do with his supposed threats. Poirot smiled faintly. Supposed? It seems you speak with more certainty about their validity than the others. Harwood's jaw tightened once more. For the first time, true agitation surfaced behind his eyes. I only meant that everyone is assuming there were threats. All we have is your word and his collapse. Poirot rose slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his coat with meticulous care. I fear, Monsieur Harwood, that your defensiveness illuminates far more than your explanations. Harwood stood as well. Are we finished? For now, Poirot said. But rest assured, we shall speak again. Harwood left the room with quick, purposeful strides. Poirot watched him go, filing away the man's mannerisms and contradictions like clues on a ledger. When the door closed, he let out a contemplative breath. He returned to the drawing room where the others waited, their gazes darting anxiously toward him. Miss Vale was wringing a handkerchief, her pale face shimmering with nervous perspiration. Lady Evelyn paced near the fire, her movements sharp and restless. Reverend Morton murmured to himself, perhaps in prayer, though his eyes remained open, watchful. Mrs. Whitcomb sat stiffly with her hands clasped, her gaze unyielding. We will continue, Poirot announced, but before I speak with the next person, I must ask a question addressed to all present. The guests tensed collectively. Did any of you witness Captain Pembroke acting strangely in the past week? Any conversations, any whispered exchanges, any moments when he seemed afraid? Miss Vale was the first to respond, though her voice trembled. He asked me several days ago whether I had seen a letter on his desk. He seemed distressed. I told him I had not, but he kept insisting someone had moved it. Lady Evelyn stared at her sharply. Clarissa, why did you not tell me this? I didn't think it was my place. Poirot nodded slowly, piecing the detail into the growing mosaic. A missing letter. Curious indeed. Reverend Morton spoke next. Captain Pembroke requested a private conversation with me 2 days ago. He asked whether I believed a man could be forgiven for a sin he had not yet committed, but feared he might be forced into. Poirot's eyes widened a fraction. A remarkable question. Mrs. Whitcomb gave a dismissive sniff. Arthur Pembroke has always been dramatic. Soldiers often are. Lady Evelyn turned on her. You speak of him as if you barely knew him. "I knew him well enough," Mrs. Whitcomb replied coolly. Poirot stepped closer. "Madame, your tone suggests a history you have not yet disclosed." Before she could answer, a thunderous crash echoed upstairs, followed by a sharp cry. Everyone froze. Poirot spun toward the staircase, his eyes narrowing with swift calculation. "Remain here," he commanded. "Do not move until I return." And without waiting for their protests, he hurried toward the source of the disturbance, aware that whatever had just transpired was not merely another accident. The game was accelerating, and the second move had just been played. Poirot ascended the staircase with swift, precise steps, his senses sharpened by the unmistakable blend of fear and intent that had reverberated through the hall after the crash. The corridor above was dimmer than the lower rooms, lit only by a few wall lamps flickering uncertainly as though startled themselves. A thin draught whispered along the floorboards, carrying with it the faint scent of something metallic, disturbingly out of place in a well-kept home. As Poirot approached the source of the sound, he detected movement behind the half-open door of a guest bedroom. He pushed it gently, and the door creaked inward. Miss Clarissa Vale stood in the center of the room, trembling violently, her hands pressed over her mouth. At her feet lay an overturned vase, its shards scattered across the carpet like fragments of a broken secret. The curtains fluttered wildly, stirred by the gust from an open window. Poirot stepped toward her slowly. "Mademoiselle, you are unharmed." She nodded, though her voice failed her. Her complexion was ghostly pale, and tears clung to her lashes. Finally, after a shuddering breath, she managed a whisper. I didn't mean to scream. It startled me." The window flew open and the vase fell. "I don't know how." Poirot's eyes moved steadily from the broken vase to the open window. Snowflakes drifted inward, settling on the sill like cold witnesses. "The latch," he murmured, examining it with meticulous care, "was forced from the outside." Miss Vale gasped. No, that cannot be. Who would climb up here?" Poirot looked once more at the sharp angle of the window pane, at the way the wood had splintered. "Not climb, mademoiselle, but perhaps reach. There is a portion of the terrace roof just below. It is not impossible for someone to step across quietly, if the person is determined." Clarissa backed away, rubbing her arms as though chilled. "But why here? Why frighten me?" Poirot turned to face her fully. "Are you certain the intention was to frighten you? Or was it to silence something you may know but have not yet revealed?" Her breath caught, and for a moment she stared at him with something far more complex than fear. Something like guilt, or perhaps dread of being discovered. "You think I'm hiding something?" Poirot replied gently. "I think, mademoiselle, that you are afraid, and people who are afraid often hide truths even from themselves." Before she could answer, footsteps hurried down the hall. Lady Evelyn appeared in the doorway, her face tight with concern. "Clarissa! Poirot! What happened? We heard the scream." "A small incident," Poirot said, "but one that suggests our intruder, or our pretended intruder, is bolder than expected." Lady Evelyn wrapped an arm protectively around her cousin. "This is intolerable. My home is being turned into a stage for terror, and my husband is lying unconscious. I want answers, Monsieur Poirot." "And you shall have them," he assured her. "But first, the window must be secured. No more opportunities for clandestine visits." He closed it carefully, tested the frame, and ensured the latch held firm. Then, guiding the two women gently from the room, he led them back downstairs. He could sense Clarissa's steps faltering, her thoughts spiraling. She was a fragile creature, but fragility did not equate to innocence. In Poirot's experience, some of the most dangerous secrets were guarded by trembling hands. When they returned to the drawing room, the atmosphere had grown even heavier. Reverend Morton stood near the mantel, His brow furrowed deeply as he contemplated the fire. Mrs. Whitcomb had positioned herself in one of the larger armchairs, as though it served as a throne for interrogation. Dr. Grace paced near the window, his agitation increasing with each passing moment. Poirot addressed them all. The disturbance upstairs confirms my earlier suspicion. Someone within this household acts under pressure of fear or desperation. The open window was no accident. Mrs. Whitcomb raised an eyebrow. And you believe this indicates an attempt on the girl's life, or merely melodrama? Poirot regarded her coolly. Madame, melodrama requires an audience. Whoever moved outside that window had no certainty that anyone would witness it. Therefore, the act was purposeful. Reverend Morton clasped his hands in front of him. But what purpose? What meaning can be found in frightening Miss Vale? Poirot turned toward Clarissa, who sat trembling beside Lady Evelyn. "Perhaps Mademoiselle knows," he said softly. Then, as her lips parted in protest, he added, "Or perhaps she knows only part of it. Secrets often reveal themselves in fragments." Clarissa shook her head. "I know nothing of danger. I told you, Arthur only asked me about a letter. That is all." Poirot studied her a moment longer, then nodded. "For now, we accept this." He shifted his focus to Dr. Grace. "Doctor, how is the captain?" Dr. Grace stopped pacing. "Still unconscious. His pulse has stabilized slightly, but he remains in serious condition. I'm beginning to suspect his collapse may not have been a simple medical incident." Poirot's voice grew quiet. "You suspect poison?" "Yes," Dr. Grace admitted, "though I cannot be certain without further examination." Lady Evelyn gave a strangled cry. "Poison? In my home?" Poirot gently rested a hand on her arm. "Madame, danger does not respect walls or wealth. It lurks where secrets gather, and tonight secrets abound." Mrs. Whitcomb sniffed with impatient disdain. "Then question someone else. I grow weary of sitting here under suspicion." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Then let us satisfy your impatience, madame. You knew Captain Pembroke well enough," you said. "Well enough to speak with confidence about his character. Well enough to suggest his collapse was dramatic rather than alarming. And well enough, perhaps, to know something of the letter from Paris." Mrs. Whitcomb's gaze flickered, ever so slightly. "I know nothing of any letter." Poirot stepped nearer. "But you knew of its existence." She stiffened. The others stared at her in collective shock. Poirot continued, "You spoke earlier as though the threat were exaggerated. Yet no one mentioned threats until after I, myself, used the word. How, madame, did you know the letter contained one?" The room fell into utter stillness. Mrs. Whitcomb's lips parted, but no explanation came. Poirot watched her with unwavering composure, knowing they had reached another significant turn. Someone had slipped. Someone had revealed knowledge they should not possess. And in that moment, Poirot felt the delicate threads of the mystery tighten, drawing the suspects ever closer to the heart of the truth. Mrs. Whitcomb did not answer at once. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked briefly toward the others before settling on Poirot with a defiance that failed to conceal the tremor beneath it. The fire crackled in the hearth, punctuating the silence as though urging her to speak. But when she finally did, her voice held only brittle indignation. "You are mistaken, Monsieur Poirot. I merely assumed the letter contained threats. Men like Captain Pembroke often attract such things." Poirot folded his hands neatly before him. "A convenient assumption, madame. Yet assumptions rarely spring from nothing. One must have a seed from which the thought grows." She stiffened further. "You think me involved in whatever madness is unfolding here?" "Preposterous." "Non," Poirot said calmly. "I think you know more than you let on. Whether that knowledge is dangerous, we shall see." Dr. Grace interjected in a strained voice. "Poirot, this line of questioning, shouldn't it wait? The captain's condition—" Poirot turned to him gently. Doctor, your concern is admirable. But time, she is not our ally. If the captain was poisoned, the person responsible remains among us, and danger does not rest. A chill drifted through the room as the weight of those words settled over the guests. Lady Evelyn moved closer to Clarissa, her protective posture intensifying, though she herself trembled. The Reverend bowed his head briefly, his expression clouded by some private meditation. Poirot paced slowly, letting his polished shoes glide across the carpet in deliberate rhythm. We must consider, mes amis, why Captain Pembroke wrote to me at all. A proud man, fiercely independent, he would not seek help unless he believed the danger grave and immediate. Reverend Morton looked up. He asked me something peculiar 2 days ago, about forgiveness for a sin yet uncommitted. Could that have been related? Poirot inclined his head. It is very possible, monsieur. A man may fear being driven toward a deed or forced into one. Clarissa shuddered violently. Arthur wasn't a criminal. He would never— Poirot raised a hand gently. Calm yourself, mademoiselle. We do not speak of crime committed by him, but crime perhaps committed against him. At this, Mrs. Whitcomb shifted uncomfortably. Poirot noticed. And now, he continued, we must address the peculiar matter of the letter's disappearance. Captain Pembroke believed someone moved it, someone within the household. Silence again. Poirot allowed his gaze to rest briefly on each face, letting the tension draw them further into the web. Then he spoke with quiet certainty. One of you has seen that letter. One of you knows what it contains. And tonight, perhaps, one of you feared I would discover that knowledge. Mrs. Whitcomb's lips parted as if to protest, but Poirot continued before she could speak. But before we return to the matter of the letter, we must reconcile ourselves with the second event this night, the opening of the window in Mademoiselle Clarissa's room. This was not merely mischief. It was a deliberate act. Clarissa whispered, but why me? Poirot regarded her steadily. Because you, mademoiselle, are the easiest to frighten, and fear, you see, creates confusion. The fearful often speak too quickly. They reveal things meant to remain hidden. Clarissa looked helplessly toward Lady Evelyn, who squeezed her shoulder. Poirot resumed pacing. Let us imagine the mind of our culprit. After the captain's collapse, uncertainty reigns. Perhaps the culprit worries that something they did, some move they made, has left a clue. Or perhaps they fear their connection to the letter may be exposed, so they create a distraction, a disturbance, something to shift attention away from themselves. Mrs. Whitcomb scoffed weakly. You make it sound like a play. Poirot bowed his head slightly. Life, madame, often imitates the theatre, particularly when deceit is in the script. The storm outside struck against the windows with renewed fury, rattling the panes. Poirot paused, listening to it, as though hearing something beyond the wind. We proceed, he said softly, with the next interview, but not here. The environment must be controlled. Mademoiselle Vale, he turned to her, you will speak with me now. Clarissa blanched. Me? Why me next? Because, Poirot said, you have twice been at the center of unusual events. First, the missing letter, and then the disturbance in your room. I already told you everything, she whispered. Poirot looked at her gently, but firmly. Perhaps. But there is the truth, mademoiselle, and then there is the truth as you believe it. He guided her toward the smaller room where he had spoken with Harwood. The others watched, tension simmering like a kettle near boiling. Inside, Poirot closed the door and gestured for Clarissa to sit. She sank into the chair with trembling limbs. The lamplight accentuated the hollow beneath her eyes. Now, Poirot began softly, you must be calm. I do not accuse you, but I must understand what you fear. Clarissa stared at her hands. I fear everything, Monsieur Poirot. This house, the storm, Arthur's collapse, and the letter. Yes, I knew of it. He did not show it to me, but I saw him reading it in the study. He was pale, shaken, and then, the next day, it was gone. Poirot leaned forward slightly. Gone? You are certain? Yes. He searched everywhere. He asked the staff. He asked me twice. And why? Poirot asked. Did he ask you twice? Clarissa hesitated. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Because I have been known to borrow stationery from his desk without asking. He thought perhaps I moved it accidentally. She met Poirot's eyes, panic rising. But I didn't. I swear I didn't. Poirot studied her expression. The sincerity, the fear, and the unmistakable shadow of another emotion, one she tried desperately to hide. Tell me, mademoiselle, he said gently, was it truly only stationery you borrowed from his desk? Her breath caught sharply. Poirot saw the truth in her silence long before she spoke, and at last, trembling, she whispered, No, there was something else. Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet triumph. Another thread had revealed itself, and he knew the tapestry of deceit within Winterbury Hall was beginning, finally, to take shape. Clarissa's admission hovered in the silence between them, fragile and trembling like the girl herself. Poirot waited without speaking, allowing her the space to gather courage. He knew from long experience that a truth coaxed gently revealed far more than one forced. At last, Clarissa bit her lip and lifted her eyes, wide, glistening, and full of a dread that suggested she feared consequences far beyond this room. I did take something else from Arthur's desk, she whispered. It was not intentional at first. I saw an envelope with my name written on it. Not boldly, almost hidden beneath a stack of correspondence. I thought it was odd he would leave something like that there. So I read it. Poirot's expression softened with encouragement. You believed it was for you, naturally. And what did it contain? Her fingers twisted around her handkerchief. It wasn't something he wrote. It was a document, a financial paper, something to do with a trust fund my parents left me. Arthur had been managing it since they died. I always believed he did so out of kindness, but the document suggested discrepancies, withdrawals I did not approve. Poirot remained motionless, though the revelation sparked immediate calculations behind his eyes. And you confronted him? No, I couldn't. I was terrified. Arthur had always been generous, protective, but if the document was correct, he had taken money meant for me. I didn't know what to think. I assumed, I hoped. There must be an explanation. Poirot leaned forward. You kept the document? She shook her head frantically. No, I put it back. I didn't want anyone to know I'd seen it. And that same evening Arthur asked me whether I had taken anything from his desk. He sounded strained, frightened. I denied it. He seemed relieved, but I could tell something was wrong. Poirot inhaled thoughtfully. And the letter from Paris, Mademoiselle, did you see even a glimpse of it? Clarissa hesitated. Only the stamp. I noticed it when I returned the document. I never opened the letter. I only saw Arthur reading it the next morning. Yet the letter disappeared soon after, Poirot murmured. And so did your certainty about the captain's benevolence. Clarissa flinched. I didn't hurt him, if that's what you think. Poirot placed a calming hand in the air. I do not think you harmed him, but secrets, mademoiselle, create shadows, and perhaps someone feared that you, with your discovery, had become dangerous. Her breath quickened. Is that why someone came to my window? It is possible, Poirot said. Or perhaps they wished merely to unsettle you. A frightened person is less likely to speak. Clarissa covered her face with trembling hands. I don't want anyone to know about the document. It could ruin Arthur's reputation, and I still don't believe he meant harm. Perhaps he was only borrowing. Poirot rose gently. One does not borrow secretly, mademoiselle, but fear not. I shall keep this matter confidential for now. We must understand the greater picture before drawing conclusions about the captain. Clarissa nodded gratefully, relief softening her trembling. Poirot guided her from the chair, and together they returned to the drawing-room, where the others waited like figures in a tableau of dread. Even the fire seemed subdued, its flames flickering low as though cautious of disturbing the tension that saturated the hall. The moment Clarissa stepped inside, Mrs. Whitcomb scrutinized her with an expression that suggested suspicion mixed with disdain. Reverend Morton observed her with silent concern. Lady Evelyn looked torn between embracing her cousin and collapsing herself under the strain of mounting uncertainty. Poirot spoke before questions could erupt. Mademoiselle Vale has provided information which sheds new light upon Captain Pembroke's recent anxieties. I shall not disclose details at this time, for they are not yet conclusive, but they reinforce one fact. He was a man carrying a great burden. Lady Evelyn pressed a hand to her chest. Burden. Arthur was always so composed. I cannot imagine what would frighten him so terribly he sought the help of a detective. Poirot regarded her with sympathy. Even the strongest facade may hide fractures, madam. Mrs. Whitcomb leaned forward. Tell us plainly, Poirot. If Arthur was afraid, what was he afraid of? Blackmail? Exposure? Something from his past? Poirot gave her a long, pointed look. An interesting choice of possibilities, madame. Almost as though you speak from familiarity. Her jaw tightened. I speak from reason. Reason, Poirot said softly, is often influenced by memory. Or guilt. Mrs. Whitcomb rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I will not sit here and be slandered. If you suspect me of something, say it directly. Poirot remained perfectly calm. I suspect, madame, that you know far more about Captain Pembroke's affairs, personal, financial, and emotional, than you pretend. Your earlier slip regarding the letter proves it. Her cheeks flushed. That was a mistake. Nothing more. Poirot stepped closer, lowering his voice to a controlled murmur that captured every ear in the room. And mistakes, madame, are often the most revealing footprints. They show which direction a person has traveled, even when they attempt to cover their tracks. Mrs. Whitcomb glared at him, but the spark of defiance was now mingled with something more fragile. Unease. Poirot turned to Dr. Grace. Doctor, may I see Captain Pembroke again? There is something I must verify. Dr. Grace nodded. Of course, but he remains unconscious. Poirot walked toward the corridor, then paused and looked back at the guests. You will all remain here. No one is to wander, and if anyone attempts to leave the room— His eyes lingered a beat too long on Mrs. Whitcomb. I shall know. A ripple of unease passed through the group as Poirot disappeared down the hall, for he sensed that the truth, once hidden beneath layers of deceit, had begun to surface at last, and someone within Winterbury Hall was desperate enough to bury it again before morning. Dr. Grace led Poirot down the corridor in tense silence, the heavy atmosphere of the house seeming to deepen with every step. The storm outside howled more fiercely than before, rattling the window panes and making the gas lamps flicker. When they reached Captain Pembroke's room, the doctor opened the door with quiet caution, as though fearful that even sound might disturb the fragile figure lying inside. The room was dim, illuminated only by a bedside lamp casting a pool of amber light across the captain's pallid face. His chest rose and fell shallowly beneath the blankets, each breath seeming to come at a considerable effort. Poirot approached with gentle steps, his gaze sharp and analytical. He was not merely assessing the captain's current state. He was looking for signs of the past hour, tiny details overlooked by anyone less observant. His condition has not changed, Dr. Grace murmured. Pulse faint, breathing irregular. If this is poison, it is one that strikes slowly yet powerfully. Poirot studied Captain Pembroke's hands. The left lay limp at his side, the right was curled inward as though clenching something long vanished. Tell me, doctor, did you examine his fingernails? Of course, Dr. Grace said, though a flicker of uncertainty betrayed him. Poirot lifted the captain's right hand with delicate precision. A faint discoloration, barely perceptible, marked the nail beds. Not enough to confirm a specific toxin, but enough to confirm suspicion. This shade, Poirot murmured, is not that of natural collapse. Dr. Grace leaned closer, frowning. I must have missed it earlier. I was focused on stabilizing him. Poirot did not offer reproach. Even the excellent doctor cannot observe all things at once. That is why Poirot is here. He lowered the captain's hand gently. This suggests something ingested, or placed upon the skin, absorbed subtly. But more importantly, it suggests forethought. Dr. Grace swallowed. Meaning someone intended this. Ah, doctor, Poirot said softly. There is intent in every hidden hand, and our culprit is not reckless, merely desperate. He approached the bedside table next, observing it with keen scrutiny. A water glass stood half full, untouched since Dr. Grace's examination. A decanter of brandy remained sealed, yet beside the lamp, nearly invisible in the dimness, Poirot spotted a folded handkerchief. He lifted it. A faint scent, floral but tinged with bitterness, rose from the cloth. Poirot brought it closer but did not inhale deeply. This does not belong to Captain Pembroke. Dr. Grace frowned. It wasn't here earlier. Poirot nodded, which means someone entered after his collapse. Someone who risked returning to the scene of danger. Before Dr. Grace could respond, a sudden noise echoed from the lower floor, a sharp clang, followed by hurried footsteps. Poirot straightened immediately. We must return. Trouble stirs again. They hurried back toward the drawing room. As they descended the staircase, the voices of the guests rose in anxious confusion. Lady Evelyn stood near the center of the room, pale and shaken. Mrs. Whitcomb was half standing from her chair, gripping the armrest with white knuckles. Reverend Morton appeared deeply distressed, while Harwood, ever controlled, watched with narrowed suspicion. Poirot entered calmly, though his presence immediately silenced the room. What has occurred? Lady Evelyn pointed toward the far wall, her voice trembling. That picture frame, it fell, without reason. It nearly struck Clarissa. Miss Vale stood near the fallen frame, shaking as though rooted to the spot. The portrait, a large oil painting of Captain Pembroke's grandfather, had crashed violently, its glass shattered into glittering shards across the carpet. Poirot approached the frame, bending to examine the wall. What is it? Harwood demanded. Poirot touched the nail protruding slightly from the plaster. The nail was loosened deliberately, only slightly, but enough that vibration or force would send it falling. Mrs. Whitcomb scoffed. Perhaps old construction. This house is not young. Poirot shook his head. No, the plaster dust around the nail is fresh. Someone tampered with it. Clarissa let out a small sob. Why are these things happening to me? First my window, now this. Reverend Morton approached her gently. My child, perhaps you should sit. Poirot's gaze remained fixed on the wall as he addressed her. Mademoiselle, you must consider the possibility that someone wishes to frighten you, and only you. But why me? She whispered. Poirot turned slowly, sweeping the room with his eyes. Because, mademoiselle, you may possess a truth you do not yet understand, and someone fears you may discover it fully. Mrs. Whitcomb crossed her arms tightly. Or perhaps the girl is overly sensitive. Not every mishap is an assassination attempt. Poirot regarded her coolly. Madame, I assure you, these are not mishaps. Too many coincidences, too precise in their aim. Dr. Grace approached Poirot discreetly. Did you find anything in the captain's room? Poirot answered in a low tone. Enough to confirm this is no natural ailment. The captain was exposed to something harmful, and someone returned to his chamber afterward. Dr. Grace's face tightened with alarm. Who? That, Poirot murmured, is what we must uncover. Poirot turned once more to the guests. Mes amis, someone in this room entered Captain Pembroke's chamber after his collapse. Someone left behind a handkerchief. I invite the owner to claim it now. The silence that followed was absolute. No one stepped forward. No one breathed. Poirot nodded to himself, as I expected. Lady Evelyn's voice quivered. Poirot, what does this mean? It means, he replied, that our culprit grows increasingly bold and increasingly afraid. He stepped to the center of the room, his presence commanding attention. We have reached a turning point. The captain is not the only target in danger. Until the truth is unveiled, none of you are safe. The storm raged outside, wind lashing against the house with ferocious intent. Winterbury Hall seemed to shudder under the weight of secrets pressing in from all corners. Poirot clasped his hands and spoke softly, yet with unmistakable authority. We continue immediately, for the shadow that hunts within these walls does not sleep, and neither shall Hercule Poirot. The wind's howl against the windows seemed almost to echo the tension settling over the drawing room as Poirot allowed the silence to linger. No one claimed the handkerchief. No one dared move. Even the fire cracked hesitantly, as though unwilling to break the heavy stillness. Poirot studied them all, his gaze drifting slowly from one face to the next. Whatever mask each person wore, indignation, fear, pity, piety, he observed how tightly it was held, and what cracks formed beneath the strain. At last he spoke. Since no one wishes to claim the handkerchief, we must assume it belongs to the person who wishes to hide the truth, a person who had reason to return to the captain's room after others had left. He looked toward Lady Evelyn. Madame, did any of the servants go upstairs since Dr. Grace carried your husband inside? Lady Evelyn shook her head. No one. I told them all to remain downstairs unless summoned. The storm frightens them. They would not wander. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Then the handkerchief comes from one among us. Mrs. Whitcomb's expression tightened. You are making this house feel like a trap, Monsieur Poirot. Madame, he replied gently, it is not Poirot who has set the trap. It is the guilty party. I merely illuminate its shape. Harwood huffed impatiently. Talk of handkerchiefs and falling paintings. This is all circumstantial. Until you have evidence, what is the sense in accusing us all? Poirot turned toward him. Ah, monsieur, you have the soul of a man who values tangible proofs above all else. But Poirot is guided by the psychology, the motive, the contradiction. When a person lies, they betray themselves long before they betray another. Harwood's jaw tightened. I have lied about nothing. Are you certain? Poirot asked softly. Even the smallest untruth leaves a shadow. Before Harwood could retort, Clarissa let out a trembling breath. Monsieur Poirot, you said earlier that someone might be frightened. I'll discover a truth I do not yet understand. But what if the truth is not mine alone? What if it concerns others here? Poirot observed her carefully. Go on, mademoiselle. Clarissa swallowed, nervously twisting her handkerchief. When I returned the document to Arthur's desk, the drawer was slightly open. Inside, I saw something else. Only for a moment. Lady Evelyn gasped. Clarissa, you never said. I didn't want to make things worse, Clarissa whispered. I thought Arthur would explain in his own time. Poirot stepped closer. What did you see, mademoiselle? A letter, she said. Not the one from Paris. A different one. It was addressed to Mrs. Pamaiuaz Whitcomb. The room froze. Even the storm outside seemed to pause in its raging. Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes widened with a sharp, involuntary flash before she controlled her expression. I know nothing of any letter, she said, but her voice lacked its earlier firmness. Poirot's moustaches twitched ever so slightly. Madame, it becomes increasingly curious how many things you do not know that seem intimately connected to Captain Pembroke's recent distress. Mrs. Whitcomb rose from her chair, her hands trembling just enough for Poirot to note. "I tire of this. You have no right—" "Sit," Poirot commanded quietly. The single word, calm, unyielding, struck with such authority that Mrs. Whitcomb sank back into her chair, shocked at herself for obeying. Lady Evelyn turned to her. "Agatha, Arthur never told me of any correspondence with you. Why would he hide it?" Mrs. Whitcomb shook her head vigorously. "I have no knowledge of it at all." Poirot raised a hand. "Perhaps that is true. Or perhaps the letter concerned a matter sensitive enough that neither you nor the captain wished it revealed." He began pacing slowly before the hearth, the firelight casting elongated shadows behind him. "We now have several threads. A missing letter from Paris, a second letter addressed to Mrs. Whitcomb, financial discrepancies concerning Mademoiselle Vale, a handkerchief left beside a gravely ill man, and a series of attempts to frighten or silence the young lady who uncovered part of the truth." He stopped, turning abruptly toward the room. "All of these cannot exist independently. They form a pattern." Reverend Morton nodded gravely. "You believe these events are part of one design?" "Precisely," Poirot said. "And someone here knows exactly how the pieces fit." Dr. Grace rubbed his brow anxiously. "Poirot, if someone is trying to frighten Clarissa, might they not escalate? Should she not be kept under strict watch?" Poirot looked at Clarissa with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his earlier firmness. "She will not be left alone. But fear not, Doctor. When the guilty party sees that Poirot grows close, they will become careless. A desperate person always does." Harwood shifted irritably. "You speak as though you already know who it is." Poirot gave a slight, enigmatic smile. "I know one thing. The attempts on Clarissa are not intended to kill her. They are clumsy, theatrical. They are meant to terrify." Clarissa whispered, "But why me?" "Because," Poirot said softly, "someone believes you might speak a truth dangerous to them, even if you do not yet understand it." Clarissa looked down, her voice quivering, but the document only showed discrepancies. "I don't know who else was involved." Poirot nodded. "Just so. But someone fears you will discover more." Mrs. Whitcomb suddenly struck the armrest with her palm. "This is madness. You accuse us of scheming, poisoning, creeping through rooms, without any proof." Poirot stepped close to her, his dark eyes sharp. "Madame, you have reacted with more agitation than any other person here. Far more than one who is truly innocent." She opened her mouth, but no words emerged. Poirot straightened. "We are nearing the heart of the matter, and before this night ends, the truth will be impossible for the guilty to hide." A crash of thunder shook the house, and the lights flickered ominously. Poirot turned toward the staircase once more, his voice low and decisive. "It is time," he said, "to examine not only what has been done, but why. Motive, mes amis, will reveal everything." And as the wind slammed against the shutters, Poirot knew the moment approached when the shadows in Winterbury Hall would finally begin to speak. The lights steadied after flickering, but the tension in the room did not. Every face reflected the same awareness. Something had shifted. The investigation was no longer about scattered peculiarities. It was narrowing, tightening, drawing them step by step toward an inevitable revelation. Poirot could feel the psychological pressure mounting, and he welcomed it. Pressure forced secrets to the surface. Pressure made the guilty tremble. He moved toward the hearth again, letting the warmth illuminate his features as he observed each suspect. "We speak now of motive," he said. "For without motive, a crime does not breathe. And here, mes amis, motives surround us like shadows." Lady Evelyn's voice cracked as she spoke. "Poirot, if Arthur's life was endangered deliberately, then someone in this house wished him harm. But why? He was respected, admired. Admired, yes, Poirot said softly, but also feared. A man of strong principles, of financial influence, of secrets he guarded closely. A man who, perhaps, held power over others. And power, madame, invites resentment. Mrs. Whitcomb let out a bitter laugh. Power. Arthur Pembroke. That man was barely able to manage his own household, let alone wield influence over others. Ah, Poirot said, turning to her with keen attention. Yet you knew of the trust he managed for Clarissa. You knew of his financial dealings well enough to criticize them. How familiar were you with the captain's monetary affairs, madame? Her face stiffened. I am a widow accustomed to managing estates. Arthur came to me occasionally for advice, that is all. For advice, Poirot repeated slowly. Or for assistance. A subtle flinch crossed her features, so slight that only Poirot perceived it. He tucked that reaction away. Reverend Morton stepped forward tentatively. Monsieur Poirot, forgive the interruption, but perhaps we should consider Captain Pembroke's concern about forgiveness. If he feared he might be compelled to act against his conscience, then perhaps another influenced him, someone who sought to manipulate him. Poirot nodded. Just so. A man does not seek spiritual counsel for trivial misunderstandings. The Reverend bowed his head. He spoke of guilt and of desperation. Dr. Grace rubbed the back of his neck anxiously. If Arthur believed he would be forced into wrongdoing, then someone held him under threat. Blackmail, perhaps. Poirot turned toward him swiftly. Yes, Dr. Grace. Blackmail is a strong possibility. Harwood shifted uncomfortably. And who here would blackmail him? What leverage could they possibly have? Poirot approached him with quiet precision. You, monsieur, deal in art, in valuables. Perhaps you know better than most how quickly fortunes can crumble when scandal surfaces. Harwood scoffed. If anyone here knows about scandal, it is Mrs. Whitcomb. Her husband's dealings were notorious. Mrs. Whitcomb's face blanched. How dare you? Poirot interjected. The past, madame, is often a more faithful witness than the present. But let us not cast stones aimlessly. Instead, we follow the pattern. Clarissa found evidence of financial discrepancies, a letter from Paris distressed Captain Pembroke, and another letter, addressed to you, madame, was hidden in his desk. Mrs. Whitcomb rose to defend herself, but Poirot raised a hand, commanding silence. I begin to see clearly, he continued. The captain was entangled in something involving money not belonging to him, and someone feared discovery. Lady Evelyn's breath hitched. You cannot mean that Arthur stole from Clarissa. He would never do such a thing. Poirot's voice was gentle, yet firm. Perhaps he did not intend wrongdoing. Perhaps he merely borrowed in anticipation of repayment. But in matters of finance, innocent intentions often breed dangerous complications. Clarissa looked stricken. I don't want him punished. I only want to understand. Poirot nodded. And we shall, mademoiselle. The lights flickered again. A deeper rumble of thunder vibrated through the house. Poirot took a few small steps, circling the room as though adjusting pieces on a chessboard. We consider next the handkerchief left beside the captain, placed there after his collapse. Why return to the scene? To observe whether he still lived? To add something to the room? Or to remove something that might incriminate? Harwood shook his head. Anyone who went back there took a huge risk. Indeed, Poirot said. And such a risk is taken only by someone who believes it necessary. Poirot stopped suddenly, his gaze landing on Dr. Grace. Doctor, remind me, did you wash your hands immediately after tending to the captain? Dr. Grace blinked in surprise. Why, yes. I cleaned myself in the washroom across the hall. Poirot nodded slowly. And in doing so, you left the captain alone. Even briefly, that was enough time for someone to enter. Mrs. Whitcomb straightened sharply. You suggest someone would poison him after he collapsed. Why? Not poison, Poirot corrected, but retrieve something. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Poirot continued in a soft but penetrating tone. The captain carried something on his person, something the culprit desperately wanted. Something he may have kept close once he realized danger was near. Lady Evelyn touched her throat. "Do you think he hid the letter?" "Perhaps," Poirot said. "Or perhaps he tore it apart, or copied it, or kept only a portion. Whatever the truth, someone believed a clue still rested with him." Clarissa looked up suddenly, her voice shaking. "Poirot, you asked whether I kept the financial document. I didn't. But what if Arthur kept something from the Paris letter?" Poirot turned slowly, his eyes brightening with sudden clarity. "Yes, that is what I begin to suspect." A shiver passed through the room. Poirot clasped his hands behind him. "Ladies and gentlemen, understand this well. The person who entered that room sought not to kill, but to conceal. Someone who feared written truth more than confrontation." Harwood exhaled sharply. "So what now?" "Now," Poirot said, "we search for what the captain hid, and we watch the reactions of those who fear it most." His eyes lingered briefly, very briefly, on one person in the room, and the faintest flicker of panic flashed across their face before they concealed it. Poirot saw it. He always did. The storm battered Winterbury Hall with a force that seemed almost symbolic, as though nature itself insisted the truth be revealed before dawn. Poirot stood near the drawing-room doors, back straight, mustaches gleaming with calm precision. One by one, he asked the guests to take their seats. No one protested this time. Even Mrs. Whitcomb, who had fought him at every turn, now lowered herself into a chair with rigid composure. Clarissa trembled beside Lady Evelyn, while Dr. Grace hovered protectively near the fire. Harwood lingered by the mantel, attempting an air of aloof skepticism, but failing to hide the tension in his jaw. Poirot closed the doors with a soft click and stepped forward. "Mes amis, the moment has come. We have wandered through shadows long enough. Now we allow the little grey cells to bring us to the light." He paced slowly, the room silent except for the storm's distant roar. "We begin with Captain Pembroke's fear, a man of discipline, of dignity. Yet his letter to me was one of desperation. Why? Because he believed he was being blackmailed." He raised a finger. "Not for a crime committed, but for one he feared the world would believe he committed. A financial scandal, mes amis." Clarissa stiffened. Poirot continued gently. "Mademoiselle Vale discovered discrepancies in the trust her parents left her. Captain Pembroke had used some of her funds, perhaps intending to repay them, perhaps acting under strain, but this alone would not have induced such terror. Non. The catalyst came from Paris." He turned to the group. "The missing letter?" Mrs. Whitcomb swallowed hard. "That letter," Poirot said, "contained a threat, written by someone who knew of the financial situation and sought to exploit it. It warned Captain Pembroke that unless money was paid, his misuse of Clarissa's funds would be exposed, ruining his honor and his family." Harwood shook his head. "But who here would know of such things?" Poirot smiled thinly. "Ah, monsieur, that is the heart of the matter. Only someone close, someone with access to ledgers, correspondence, and the trust." Lady Evelyn gasped softly. "But only Arthur, and Clarissa, and—" Her voice trailed off. Poirot nodded toward Mrs. Whitcomb. "Oui. Madame Whitcomb." All eyes turned to her. She sat very still, but her knuckles whitened upon the armrests. Poirot resumed. "You advised Captain Pembroke on financial matters. You helped him navigate debts after poor investments. You had access to his accounts, and more importantly, he trusted you." Poirot's voice softened. "But trust, madame, is a dangerous weapon." She exhaled shakily. "You cannot prove that." Poirot held up a hand. "I do not deal in proof of the courts, madame. I deal in proof of the soul, and yours has spoken loudly." He turned to the others. The Paris letter was not written by an outsider. It was arranged through a contact abroad, someone easily paid. But the mastermind was here. Madame Whitcomb saw an opportunity. She knew Captain Pembroke had taken from Clarissa's trust. She understood his sense of honor would make him vulnerable to blackmail. Mrs. Whitcomb's lips tightened. A ridiculous theory. Poirot's eyes glinted. Then we proceed to the second letter, the one addressed to you. A murmur rippled through the room. Poirot continued, Captain Pembroke found it. He confronted you, quietly, privately, and you panicked. The gentleman would not expose you publicly. He would seek resolution, appeal to your shared history, but you feared he would reveal your scheme to Lady Evelyn, or perhaps to Clarissa. Mrs. Whitcomb stood abruptly. You have no idea what you are talking about. Poirot did not waver. Then let us speak of the handkerchief in the captain's room. He turned toward her, voice sharpened just enough. It bore your perfume, madame, a very distinctive scent. He tapped his temple. Honeysuckle and myrrh. Not common. Mrs. Whitcomb faltered. The room held its breath. You went to retrieve the Paris letter, Poirot said softly. But the captain regained partial consciousness. Perhaps he reached for you, perhaps he whispered your name, but you fled before he could speak. Clarissa gasped. Lady Evelyn pressed a hand to her chest. Harwood stepped back as though struck. Poirot continued. Then, to mislead us, you loosened the picture frame bolt. You rattled Clarissa's window. You wished her to appear unstable, frightened, unreliable, all to deflect suspicion. Mrs. Whitcomb shook her head frantically. I did nothing of the sort. Poirot stepped forward, the firelight illuminating his calm certainty. Madame, your downfall came from something very small, something you did not even realize you had done. When Clarissa mentioned the Paris letter, you referred to it as a threat before anyone else did, even before Lady Evelyn knew of its existence. He leaned closer. That slip revealed everything. Mrs. Whitcomb stared at him, her defiance cracking, then shattering. Her breathing quickened. She clutched the back of the chair, shaking her head as though refusing the truth itself. I did not mean for him to die, she whispered suddenly, voice raw. I only meant to frighten him, just enough that he would pay. Tears flooded her eyes. But when he collapsed, it was so sudden. I panicked. I only wanted to retrieve the letter so no one would know. Poirot nodded solemnly. You did not administer the poison. That was accidental, a reaction he had to a tonic already in his system. You merely pushed him toward collapse with fear. But fear, madame, is as dangerous as any blade. A sob tore from her. Reverend Morton murmured a prayer under his breath. Lady Evelyn looked torn between horror and pity. Harwood stared in disbelief. Clarissa wept quietly, overwhelmed by the betrayal at her doorstep. Poirot addressed them all. Captain Pembroke lives. He will recover, and when he awakens, he will confirm what Madame Whitcomb feared most, that he confronted her about the letter, that he attempted to protect Clarissa's future. Mrs. Whitcomb collapsed into her chair as though the life had left her. Poirot's voice softened, yet held its unmistakable authority. Madame, blackmail is a cruel thing. It preys on fear, on pride, on loyalty. But you allowed desperation to overcome humanity. She covered her face and sobbed. Poirot turned toward Lady Evelyn. Madame, your husband will need support when he wakes. His honor has been tested, but not broken. Lady Evelyn nodded, tears glistening. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. Thank you. Poirot inclined his head modestly. It is nothing, madame. I merely followed the truth where it led. He stepped toward the window, gazing out at the waning storm. Snow still fell, but now lightly, peacefully, as though Winterbury Hall itself had exhaled. Poirot spoke in a softer, reflective tone. Ah, human nature. It is a fascinating tapestry, woven with greed, fear, love, deceit, and hope. Strip away the layers, and you will always find the truth waiting quietly beneath." He turned back to them with a gentle smile. "And that, mes amis, is why one must rely on the little grey cells." As dawn crept across the horizon, Hercule Poirot retrieved his hat, adjusted his cuffs, and offered his final farewell. "Justice has been restored, and now I take my leave. Christmas awaits, and even the detective must enjoy a moment of peace." With that, he departed Winterberry Hall, leaving behind a house forever changed and a secret twilight now laid bare in the light of truth.